Republican? The answer, John F. Kennedy. When he was elected president in 1960, Kennedy's views were considered mainstream in the Democratic Party. But while the Kennedy name is still revered by the Democrats today, the policies he espoused are not. Ronald Reagan, America's 40th president, who was a Democrat much of his life, famously said, "I didn't leave the Democratic Party, the party left me." If a Democrat advocated the positions on race, taxes, foreign policy, guns, and abortion that our 35th president once did, he wouldn't be a Democrat. He belonged to that other party.
60s, one of the most powerful, eloquent defenders of tax cuts was John F. Kennedy. As JFK said, some men see things as they are and ask why. I see things that never were and ask why not. JFK would be a Republican today.
Yes. That is the choice that our nation must make. A choice that lies not merely between two men or two parties, but between the public interest and private comfort, between national greatness and national decline, between the fresh air of progress and the stale, dank atmosphere of normalcy, between dedication or mediocrity. All mankind waits upon our decision. A whole world looks to see what we shall do.
Mentioned medical care for the aged. Our program was an amendment to the Kerr Bill. The Kerr Bill provided assistance to all those who were not on Social Security. I think it's a very clear contrast. In 1935, when the Social Security Act was written, 94 out of 95 Republicans voted against it. Mr. Landon ran in 1936 to repeal it. In August of 1960, when we tried to get it again, but this time for medical care, we received the support of one Republican in the Senate on this occasion. Thirdly, I think the question before the American people is, as they look at this country and as they look the world around them, the goals are the same for all Americans. The means are at question. The means are at issue. If you feel that everything that is being done now is satisfactory, that the relative power and prestige and strength of the United States is increasing in relation to that of the communists, that we are gaining more security, that we are achieving everything as a nation that we should achieve, that we're achieving a better life for our citizens and greater strength, then I agree. I think you should vote for Mr. Nixon. But if you feel that we have to move again in the 60s, that the function of the president is to set before the people the unfinished business of our society, as Franklin Roosevelt did in the 30s.
Where another former president stood and fought this issue out of Social Security against the same charges. The bill itself and read it. All these arguments were made against Social Security at the time of Franklin Roosevelt. They're made today.
Peace. What kind of a peace do I mean, and what kind of a peace do we seek? Not a Pax Americana, enforced on the world by American weapons of war. Not the peace of the grave or the security of the slave. I am talking about genuine peace, the kind of peace that makes life on earth worth living, the kind that enables men and nations to grow and to hope and build a better life for their children. Not merely peace for Americans, but peace for all men and women. Not merely peace in our time, but peace in all time. I speak of peace because of the new face of war. Total war makes no sense in an age where great powers can maintain large and relatively invulnerable nuclear forces and refuse to surrender without resort to those forces. It makes no sense in an age where a single nuclear weapon contains almost 10 times the explosive force delivered by all the Allied air forces in the Second World War. It makes no sense in an age when the deadly poisons produced by a nuclear exchange would be carried by wind and water and soil and seed to the far corners of the globe and to generations yet unborn. Today, the expenditure of billions of dollars every year on weapons acquired for the purpose of making sure we never need them is essential to the keeping of peace.
I'm not satisfied when we have over $9 billion worth of food, some of it rotting, even though there is a hungry world, and even though 4 million Americans wait every month for a food package from the government, which averages 5 cents a day per individual. I saw cases in West Virginia, here in the United States, where children took home part of their school lunch in order to feed their families, because I don't think we're meeting our obligations towards these Americans. I'm not satisfied when many of our teachers are inadequately paid, or when our children go to school part-time shifts. I think we should have an educational system second to none. I'm not satisfied when we are failing to develop the natural resources of the United States to the fullest. Here in the United States, which developed the Tennessee Valley, and which built the Grand Coulee and the other dams in the northwest United States, at the present rate of hydropower production, and that is the hallmark of an industrialized society, the Soviet Union by 1975 will be producing more power than we are. I'm not satisfied until every American enjoys his full constitutional rights. If a Negro baby is born, and this is true also of Puerto Ricans and Mexicans in some of our cities, he has about 1/2 as much chance to get through high school as a white baby. He has 1/3 as much chance to get through college as a white student. He has about 1/3 as much chance to be a professional man, about 1/2 as much chance to own a house. He has about 4 times as much chance that he'll be out of work in his life as the white baby. I think we can do better. I don't want the talents of any American to go to waste.
It ought to be possible, therefore, for American students of any color to attend any public institution they select without having to be backed up by troops. It ought to be possible for American consumers of any color to receive equal service in places of public accommodation, such as hotels and restaurants and theaters and retail stores, without being forced to resort to demonstrations in the street. And it ought to be possible for American citizens of any color to register and to vote in a free election without interference or fear of reprisal. It ought to be possible, in short, for every American to enjoy the privileges of being American without regard to his race or his color.
The matter is that what we are now talking about doing, most of the countries of Europe did years ago. The British did it 30 years ago. We are behind every country pretty nearly in Europe in this matter of medical care for our citizens. And then those who say that this should be left to private efforts. In those hospitals in New Jersey where the doctors said they wouldn't treat anyone, who paid their hospital bills through Social Security, those hospitals and every other new hospital, the American people, all of us, contribute 1/2, 1 or 2/3 for every new hospital, the national government. We pay 55% of all the research done. We help young men become doctors. We are concerned with the progress of this country, and it involves the government because it involves the public welfare. The Constitution of the United States did not make the President or the Congress powerless. It gave them definite responsibilities to advance the general welfare, and that is what we're attempting to do.
Possible to gain a $700 million to $1 billion through tax changes, which I believe would close up loopholes on dividend withholding, on expense accounts. Fourthly, I have suggested that the medical care for the aged and the bill which the Congress now has passed and the President signed, if fully implemented, would cost $1 billion on the Treasury out of the Treasury funds and $1 billion by the state. The proposal that I have put forward, and which many of the members of my party support, is for medical care financed under Social Security, which would be financed under the Social Security tax system, which is less than 3 cents a day per person for medical care, doctors' bills, nurses, hospitals when they retire. It is actuarially sound. So in my judgment, We would spend more money in this administration on aid to education. We'd spend more money on housing. We'd spend more money, and I hope more wisely, on defense than this administration has done. But I believe that the next administration should work for a balanced budget, and that would be my intention. Mr. Nixon misstates my figures constantly. It's also a national responsibility. The argument has been used against every piece of social legislation in the last 25 years. The people of the United States individually could not have developed the Tennessee Valley. Collectively, they could have. A cotton farmer in Georgia, or a peanut farmer, or a dairy farmer in Wisconsin or Minnesota, he cannot protect himself against the forces of supply and demand in the marketplace, but working together in effective governmental programs, he can do so. 17 million Americans who live over 65 on an average Social Security check of about $78 a month. They're not able to sustain themselves individually, but they can sustain themselves through the Social Security system. I don't believe in big government, but I believe in effective governmental action. In 1933, Franklin Roosevelt said in his inaugural that this generation of Americans has a rendezvous with destiny. I think our generation of Americans has the same rendezvous. The question now is, can freedom be maintained under the most severe attack it has ever known? I think it can be. And I think in the final analysis, it depends upon what we do here. I think it's time America started moving again.
Between an alert and progressive citizen and a progressive government is what has made this country great, and we shall continue as long as we have the opportunity to do so.
Abolish all forms of human poverty, but a call to bear the burden of a long twilight struggle, year in and year out, rejoicing in hope, patient in tribulation, a struggle against the common enemies of man, tyranny, poverty, disease, and war itself. Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country.
If I asked myself what made him a great president, and was it just the charm, or was it the Peace Corps, the space program, civil rights, going after the mob, all of these other things he did?
Yeah, we actually want to increase tax revenue. In other words, we want to bring in more money. And how are we going to do that? He doesn't say we're going to do that by trickle down. He says we're going to do that by closing loopholes. Now, this GOP tax scam just added a whole bunch of new loopholes. In fact, I'm going to be looking at it. I'm going to be talking to my CPA sometime before the end of the year going, hey, this pass-through thing, I've got a corporation here that's, theoretically a pass-through company. My understanding is that, from what I've read, it's only going to apply to real estate companies and stock speculators, to the big boys. Only Donald Trump and Paul Ryan and Bob Corker can take advantage of that. Bob Corker with his $7 million a year in pass-through income. He's going to save $1 million on his taxes at least. But, apparently I can't. I don't, but I don't know. We'll find out. But, the bottom line is that Kennedy, when Kennedy was speaking about this, he was saying we're going to close these loopholes. Not we're going to add more loopholes, which is what the Republicans just did. He said we're going to close the loopholes, and with the extra money from that, we're going to increase our spending on education. We're going to increase our spending on health. We're going to increase our spending on housing. Now, you don't do that with a tax cut, right? You do that with a tax increase. But to this day, Republicans are still misquoting or just plain old flat out lying about John Kennedy. Of course, was saying, oh, Kennedy's calling for a tax cut, and I'm calling for a tax cut. Let's lower the tax rates on the millionaires, and quack, quack, quack. And Kennedy, and just like Reagan did. Reagan lied about Kennedy's tax cuts, too. Or tax changes, cuts, although it was a tax cut. It was from 91 to 47.4% for the very top rate. He's tax changes because he knew that what he was proposing would increase revenues. So it really wasn't a tax cut. Rich people were going to pay more money. He's proposing a $1 billion tax increase back in 1960. That's like, maybe a $100 billion tax increase in today's dollars. I mean, that was really significant. Back then, the minimum wage was what, $1.50 or something like that? And, now it's $7. So you could do the math. I mean, it's
Actually, it would be over $10 now if it was where it was back then. So here's Kennedy proposing a tax increase of over $1 billion. Nixon had been arguing for a tax cut, saying that Kennedy was in favor of a tax cut. Kennedy says Nixon's lying. And then the next generation, Reagan comes along, and he lies about what Kennedy did. And to this day, you have conservatives saying, well, Jack Kennedy cut taxes and it raised the income to the government. No, he didn't cut taxes. He proposed raising taxes. He cut the top rate, but he raised the tax rate. $100 to $800 billion. Now, that's trillions of dollars in today's money. Right? $2-3 trillion at least. I mean, that's a massive amount of money in today's money. And how are we going to gain this money? We're going to close the loopholes for rich people and business people, because he knew where those loopholes are. He was a rich business guy, or his daddy was the business guy. He was a rich, Kennedy, he knew this stuff. And then he goes on to say, not only am I going to raise taxes on rich people, I mean, we may lower the top tax rate, but we're going to close enough loopholes that they're going to start paying, damn it. Not only are we going to do that, but here's how we're going to spend the money. Nixon was running around going, that Kennedy, he's going to lower taxes. He's going to cause the budget to go into deficit. He's going to cause all kinds of, which is, by the way, what Reagan did. But it's not what Kennedy did. It's not what Kennedy proposed. Kennedy proposed actually lowering the top tax rate and closing enough loopholes that rich people paid more in taxes. And LBJ did that. He did that. And tax revenues went up. And rich people paid more in taxes. And CEOs only made 30 times what their average workers did because they had no loopholes. They had no way to get more than 30 times before they started paying 74% taxes. And who wants to do that? Until Ronnie Reagan came along and dropped that top tax rate from 74% down to 28%. And all of a sudden, it was, woohoo, happy times are here again.
Considered a paragon of liberal politics. He had an interesting and complicated career. In some ways, what we would call a progressive today, but then in some ways, Dwight D. Eisenhower, his Republican predecessor, was also considered a progressive. Now, Kennedy made his name in the 1950s when he was first elected to the United States Senate by speaking out in favor of the revolutionary independence movement in Algeria. Kind of a bold thing to do, and he said he eventually became famous for saying that those who make peaceful evolution impossible make violent revolution inevitable. Pretty progressive thing to say. For his death, he did commit himself to the civil rights struggle, which was a courageous thing for him to do. Lyndon Johnson ultimately completed that effort. So we do have many progressive milestones in the JFK presidency. So again, worth noting the centennial of John Fitzgerald Kennedy. This
reality is, yes, powerful people were furious at JFK for not declaring that war that they had already planned with Cuba to get their money back and to get their companies back, etc. And that's what got JFK killed.
There is a lot of myths out there that are still repeated today as to President Kennedy's posture, both in terms of specifically Vietnam, but in terms of war in general.
I think clearly the impact that he had on the world was not just the Alliance for Progress or, the vigor or the charm of his administration, but it was this pursuit, this extraordinary pursuit for peace that was at the core of his presidency, the repulsion of war that he had as a combat veteran himself. He told one of his best friends, Ben Bradley, that I am almost a peace at any price president. He said that he regarded his primary mission as president of the United States as keeping the country out of war. And that put him at odds with the military-industrial complex, with the Joint Chiefs of Staff and an intelligence apparatus led by Dulles, who he quickly fired, which defined his presidency. And, if virtually kind of the opposite of that was the Cuban Missile Crisis, where he stood against his own national security advisors, his own Joint Chiefs of Staff, virtually all of his advisors.
Of Pigs was was basically left for President Kennedy, or I should say, it was a legacy project of Eisenhower's. Is that right?
That's right. It was actually a legacy project of Nixon's. Nixon had met with Castro and become convinced that he was either communist, in his own words, either communist or under communist influence, and therefore had to be gotten rid of. And then he nationalized the lands. Khrushchev nationalized the land. Castro nationalized the lands of the United Fruit Company. In retaliation for that, Standard Oil closed its refinery in Cuba, and Castro began buying oil from the Russians in exchange for sugar. And so at that point, the Eisenhower administration decided we have to attack Cuba. Nixon claimed to be the brainchild, in his words, quote, brainchild, end quote, of the Bay of Pigs. Eisenhower approved it a year before, for March of 1961, which landed 3 months into JFK's presidency. He was alarmed by the stench of and recoiled from the stench of the project almost immediately and didn't want to do it. He got assurances, the 1,500 Cuban troops had been trained in Nicaragua and Guatemala and were transported on United Fruit boats to the Bay of Pigs to avoid any kind of fingerprints of the U.S. on the attack. And what President Kennedy wanted assurances from Allen Dulles, who was the head of the CIA, General Cabell, who was the second in command, and Bissell, who was third in command, and all three of those men were fired afterwards. And he demanded assurances that there was no chance of failure, and that there would be no need for any U.S. military involvement. He also demanded the same assurances from the Joint Chiefs of Staff and General Lemetzer, who was its chair. And Lemetzer, for his own reasons,
Bobby,
was furious at the CIA for putting these brave men in that position. And he said, as they folded on the beach, and Dulles came back to him and begged for air cover, which he had promised not to do, or to send in the Essex, which was the aircraft carrier in the battle group. Jack said to Dave Powers, Kenny O'Donnell, and Arthur Schlesinger, I want to take the CIA, shatter them into a million pieces, and scatter them to the wind. And afterwards, he cracked down on the CIA, defunded it by 20%, and fired its three top leaders whenever he convened them, with plans to do against the Soviet Union. And they would say to him, here are the numbers, we will lose 30 million Americans, but we will kill 160 Russians, and we will have world domination for the next century if we do this. So this is something we need to do. And they believed that he was treasonous from the moment that he failed to bring in air support during the Bay of Pigs, and then later when he refused to go into Laos, which they wanted, which Eisenhower during his transition talk urged my Uncle Jack, you have to go into Laos to support the CIA puppet that the CIA, that Allen Dulles had put in there, who is now being overwhelmed by Pathet Lao communist guerrillas. And Jack said, very, very carefully questioned them. How many troops will it take? They said 140,000 troops and probably nuclear weapons. And with that information in hand, he went and negotiated with 14 other states, including the Soviet Union, a neutrality agreement that allowed the communist participation in the government of Laos. So he was already pegged with having lost Laos, having lost, Cuba. And then he didn't bomb them in Berlin. When Lucius Clay tried to plow down the Berlin Wall, and that President Kennedy made, and the greatest speech of his career was the American University speech, where he proposed bilateral disarmament, the end of the Cold War, and the nuclear test ban, beginning with the nuclear test ban treaty. And The speech, he did not vet the speech with the State Department, the CIA, or the Pentagon. They were shocked by it. They were more shocked when they found out that he already had negotiators in Moscow negotiating directly with Khrushchev, and in 3 months he had a treaty already done. So he was able to end run them, but he had to do that because they did his, John McCone, who was then head of the CIA, and the Joint Chiefs went to Congress and fought like hell to make sure that the Test Ban Treaty, which banned the underground atmospheric or explosions of nuclear weapons in space.
President Kennedy's plan to withdraw from Vietnam and how this was reversed within days of his death.
I mean, it's fashionable now for people to think of the Vietnam War as a smooth continuum that began with Eisenhower, went to President Kennedy, then to Johnson, and then to Nixon. But in fact, President Kennedy fought like hell from the beginning to not go into Vietnam. And a month before his death, he signed a national security order which made it the official policy of the United States to withdraw all troops, all U.S. personnel from Vietnam by the end of 1965, with the first 1,000 by December of 63. And when he was killed in November of 63, the first 1,000 were already being evacuated. Now, within 72 hours, Lyndon Johnson met with Dean Rusk, who was the Secretary of Defense at that time, and said, I am not going to be the president that loses Vietnam. And they began an escalation that would end up. The day that President Kennedy died, there were only 16,000 advisors in Vietnam. From the first day in office, he had been urged to put combat troops in. He refused again and again and again. He raised the number of advisors slightly. But even when he died, there were fewer advisors in Vietnam than he sent. He sent 20,000 troops to Mississippi to get Medgar Evers to integrate Ole Miss, to get one black student into Ole Miss. And there were 4,000 fewer troops or advisors that they sent to Vietnam, and they were technically not allowed to participate in combat, although some of them were doing that. And the day he died, the day before he died, he reviewed casualty lists that showed that to date at that point, the 73rd American had just been killed in Vietnam. And he told his aide, that's it. Vietnam is not worth a single more American life. I'm going to get out when I come back from Dallas.
Now,
Jack and Bobby Kennedy, just before the assassination, were doing two simultaneous things. One, they were very aggressively and very, very close to successfully trying to negotiate peace and rapprochement with Castro.
Republicans are so opposed to Jack Kennedy and everything. Oh my God, he wants to expand the United Nations? We can't have that. They just work for world peace. Come on, that's why they were created. There, and you keep in mind, this was June of 1963. Within 2-3 years, we were digging into Vietnam in a big way. Within 5 years, we were huge at Vietnam. And I don't think Lyndon Johnson shared Jack Kennedy's "we don't want a war" perspective, tragically, of peace. That's amazing. And yes, it is strategic, right? Being an advocate for peace, this is like a really good and healthy thing. In fact, there's a bunch of good and healthy things to stand for that Jack Kennedy stood for, that we have completely lost sight of, or at least our media has lost sight of, and sometimes I think even in some ways some Democrats have lost sight of, and we need to constantly remind ourselves of these things.
In Vietnam, yes, and it wasn't a good thing. But the guy who really put that on steroids was Lyndon Johnson, who was also a Democrat, and also has good and bad parts to his legacy. I spent most of my teenage years shouting, "Hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today?" So I certainly was no fan of Lyndon Johnson then. In retrospect, I think his War on Poverty was a damn good program. But it was Lyndon Johnson who made that decision. He made that decision in early December of 1963. And, I don't remember the exact date of the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, but that was really what kicked off the war in Vietnam.
Because, for two reasons. One, the killing of Jack Kennedy was a consequential change in the political direction of America. And number two, I think it's really important that we know our own history, even when it's unpleasant.
Lincoln said, figures don't lie, but liars sure can figure.